like there's a lot of love in the air this weekend, with all the news dominating the developments in Ukraine, which seems to be getting by the hour closer to what seems to be now an inevitable outcome, at least according to the US messaging, after the president of Russia and the president of the United States had a call yesterday. It looks like nothing really resolved. And now the US president and his team are messaging that there could be conflict within days, and people and all of the embassies are warning their people to leave and all of that type of stuff. So it's hard to kick off this morning with a week in review without that being front and center, regardless of what was previously intended, with all the headlines we have of different things. But oil prices traded up on Friday, moving across $95 in intraday trading and then settling back, closing just below 95 on Brent. Let's kick off with Christoph Ruhl, regular Sunday morning commentator, senior research scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy in Columbia University. Christoph, not sure really where to start, other than it strikes me, given the scale of what has been forecast, the markets have not priced in what seems to be a full invasion plan.
I'm not so sure about that. So good morning, first of all. And we had discussed this several times, and your webinar was ahead of most of the press reporting and saying that this is going to get very serious. And now we seem to be there. And you know the saying that the first casualty of war is the truth. And that seems to have happened too. And when you look at the messaging, it is actually rather strange, because you have like two levels of messages. One is the official statements from the US, which insist in saying that President Putin has not made up his mind yet. And then these quoted CIA or other security service unnamed sources, which say, oh, it's going to happen on Wednesday, or it's going to happen on Tuesday, it's going to happen on the 20th. So there are some who still think that there is this new sort of glasnost propaganda from the US side, which we had with us from the beginning, where they're very explicit in trumping out and sounding out everything they knew, every little rumor, everything, in an hope of preempting the Russian capacity to stall a surprise. So there are some people who still think this is part of the messaging to avoid a war. I personally find it very hard. Still, I find it hard to believe that Russia would actually do that, full-scale invasion and taking Kiev. My Russian friends have all gone silent, meaning that they believe that essentially Putin has put himself in a corner where he has no choice. If he doesn't do it now, he will never have the opportunity like that again, because the Ukraine will be much better protected, much better armed, and all of that. He has his economists rightly telling him, you're pretty safe from sanctions. And he has his generals rightly telling him, you're pretty superior, you can take Kiev in a day if you want. And he has his strategists, always their 80s advisors, say, yeah, the Ukraine is part of us, of the family. So that all speaks, and then what I heard, and apparently this is sort of common knowledge and a common worry, interestingly, in Russia, this is a man who doesn't use the internet. You know? So he depends on this close circle of advisors. And it suddenly all starts to look like very 20-year-old advice. So it's quite likely. I myself still think, even if it's a bluff, the Russians know about brinkmanship. They will carry it right to the edge and maybe a little further. I still think it may not happen. That would be my basic proposition. On the oil market side, we have worries, of course, but we also have a very, very steep backwardation. So prompt prices, the difference between prices today and prices a month from now or 3 months from now are already as big as they have been in a very long time. And I think that's where it's priced in to some extent. So in a sense, if supplies would come up a little bit from OPEC, and if there would be no war in the Ukraine, we probably see a quite dramatic fall in the price of $10 or so. That could happen with this kind of backwardation. If the war starts, then all eyes will be on the ability of the Western alliance to impose sanctions, not only on the financial sector, but on energy exports. And I wrote a piece on this, which is on your site here for those interested, where basically the key statement is that right now, in the short term, if the European Union were to sanction Russian energy exports, that would be like using your nose to hit somebody's fist. It's just not going to happen. And the market clearly thinks that also applies to oil prices. But to sum up, I mean, no matter what the market thinks, and you might be right on that one, there is at least a 50-50 chance that things go really bad.
I think the main market focus I would have in sort of making my opening comment was more about the financial markets, the risk on markets of equities and elsewhere don't seem to be pricing in the full scale disruption. Let's go to the other side of the world. Dr. Xavier Chen, CEO of CN Innovation and president of Beijing Energy Club. Maybe he's in the perfect place one would want to be in when there's so much uncertainty and potential even war in Europe, near where Dr. Xavier used to live in Paris. But Dr. Xavier now in northern Thailand. Just generally speaking, Dr. Xavier, what does this story look like from Asia, from where you are in Thailand? And maybe we can articulate what it might look like from China, but from just Asia in general, what does the Russian-Ukraine crisis look like?
Well, good morning, everybody. So greetings from a very peaceful northern part of Thailand called Chiang Mai. So certainly from such a peaceful place, I and we do not want to see any war happening around the world. And what's happening in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia, and also confrontation between Russia and West is really worrisome. But I would think that looking from Asia, it's not such a distant thing from us. Number one is this is part of a new political game change, and which is actually happening. So without the precedent, everything is under the making. So this is just a part of the global reformation process. And that's really involve all countries, not only just those concerned. Second, I would say the China role would be also very important because President Putin was in China and reached a number of agreements, in particular in energy, but I'm not sure if there will be some other kind of understanding between China and Russia. For example, in case of Russia invasion of Ukraine, what will be the Chinese position? So I would think that the Russia president, when he goes to China, this could be part of the agenda. So the China position in this is also very important. And then the third element, I would say that, from the Asia perspective, we now focus more and more on economic recovery, on regional cooperation. The RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Program, went into effect 1st January this year. So this will boost the trade and investment among 15 nations of this ASEAN plus 5, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, Australia, and China. So, and then the fourth thing I would say that all these anxieties related to Russia-Ukraine situation, and also Christoph said, about the oil prices, and this will be very worrisome because this essentially, as you say, Sean, impact will be through the financial markets, and many of the oil products are traded in the financial markets, and Asian as a whole really rely on imports. China now is around 74% relying on imports. So any price hike will have macroeconomic impacts on the Chinese economy. So we, from an Asian perspective, we want not to have a war. Let's focus on cooperation and peace, and then recover from the COVID and put the world back in check. So I'm playing for not having war.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit like, Christoph, that the Chinese are giving Putin a lot of cover on this one. And part of that, I'm going to come back to Dr. Xavier's point of this is part of a general global restructuring. But Christoph, just looking at the energy side, clearly if Russia takes over the Ukraine, then the Nord Stream 2 project becomes somewhat redundant anyway, because he will have control over the Ukraine pipeline rather than Russia being vulnerable to Ukrainian disruption of its cross routes. But also, Russia would have control of a lot of other very valuable exports that come out of the Ukraine. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that where the other wider sort of macro commodity impact might be.
I will, if you promise to come back to the geopolitical change, because that
please.
really matters.
Yeah.
So one should never underestimate the ability of someone 20 years plus in power to shoot himself in the foot. Because as indeed, as you said, there's a great deal of integration, of global integration of Russia's exports, which would be at least slowing down. And in terms where it really matters, we have Russia as the biggest energy and commodity exporter in the world if you add all these things up. Obviously, what everybody talks about is oil and natural gas. 40% of Europeans' consumption imported from 40% plus, actually. 50% of Germany consumption comes from Russia. The Ukraine used to be Europe's breadbasket before the war, and that is basically almost back. So it's a huge agricultural importer. Much of that is already, and more will be in the future, redirected from Europe into Russia, because Russia has been imposed sanctions also on foodstuff imports in 2014 after they occupied Crimea. And generally speaking, what we will see is that sanctions in the energy and the commodity space will in the long term work only if the rank of the sanctioning countries is tight and closed. And in this case, it's not, because there is China on the other side. And you will see energy is fungible, commodity exports are fungible. You will see them redirected into countries which don't agree with the sanctions, and from there entering into global markets. So this Iran scenario, where you really sort of try to lock up a country complete with getting everyone on board, is not going to happen on Russia. This will take time, and in some instances it will not be possible. For example, gas is produced in West and East Siberia. Whatever is produced in Western Siberia can only be transferred into LNG or go straight by pipeline to Europe. There is yet no Trans-Siberian pipeline to bring it into Asia. So that there are some bottlenecks there which will make Russia suffer. But in the medium and in the long term, there is no chance that a country which is so important also for lithium, for nickel, for things which we need for the energy transition, will be completely shut out of global markets. So what this will do is just to increase what an economist calls transaction costs, global transaction costs for all these raw materials. That means makes life a little bit more expensive for all of us. That is going to be the net result. Having said that, there's something interesting here when one looks at the Russian side. Russia grew since 2000 about 5% every year, Russia's economy. Since 2014, this is since sanctions went up, the oil price came down, and Crimea was occupied, growth is down to 0.9%. Over the same period, the rest of the world has grown with 3.4%, meaning Russian citizens are falling further and further and further behind every single year. That is the impact not only of sanctions, actually the IMF has calculated sanctions a very small fraction of that, but mostly of fortifying the economy, tight fiscal policy, getting out of financing with US dollars for the private sector and for the government sector, accumulating huge reserves of dollars and gold. Over the years since 2014, that had brought down growth a lot, as I said, from 5 to less than 1%. But it also means that Russia has already shouldered a huge part of the costs for creating this crisis, whereas the rest is only now starting to look at its own costs implied by sanctions. And in the West, when you look at the structure, especially of energy exports, it's only the US who can go for maximum sanctions at the moment, because they are a net energy exporter and a capital importer. The European Union can ill afford, because it cannot suddenly displace Russian coal and gas in one winter. And I mean, they could tighten their belts, but I don't see the political will for doing this in Central Europe.
Well, thankfully, it's been a mild enough winter. Dr. Xavier, just coming back to the point you made about this sitting, I mean, you made 4 points in your opening comment, but in the restructuring, global restructuring, could you please just speak a little bit more to that point as to what that exactly means?
Well, global restructuring, you know, what I can see is that a number of fronts. Number one is country-to-country relations, I would say. You know, in the past, the US and China used to be partners and cooperation. Now they are more and more towards adversaries and competition. And this changes a lot. in the global setting. Second is all the global systems. United Nations, for example, is that effective? WTO, is that effective? So these global governments, whether political, economic, and even the WHO, if I may say, all these prove to be in need of reform. And then thirdly, this economic power change, China's rise in exports, in growth, and then also, I would say, all the impacts that has played, in relationship with the US, with the European Union, all the trade frictions. And then last thing I would say is technology. You have at one side advances in digitalization that changes everything. And then second is all these decarbonization technologies is also really working very rapidly in cost reduction and improvements. So all these elements together, the Chinese leadership a few years ago said that we are living in a period of change without any precedent over the last century. So this is the time that we should stay focused, not to be disturbed, and then do our internal matters well. So
Dr. Xavier, do you think is China in this equation of Russia, Europe, this instability, and even whatever level of crisis we are in and we get to, it's already absorbing a lot of stress, that China is a winner in that equation, that Europe and the West are fractured and China just will be a winner out of that? Is that too simple? Are there negative consequences for China as well?
I don't think that China is a net winner or whatever thought in that case. For China's prosperity and growth, China needs to be in good relations with the West. China should not just be aligned with Russia as a strategic alliance or whatever thought. So that's my personal opinion. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, in these kind of circumstances, I would say that China has its own strategic demands. For example, also very much squeezed by the United States in all fronts. And you have also Taiwan issue, you have Hong Kong issue, you have so many other kinds of issues that China and the US is in confrontation. So when this power in confrontation and the other power is also in confrontation, and you find the nature kind of alliances, synergy, I would say, between Russia and China, try to help each other to solve its own, their respective problems.
Christoph, your thoughts on that? I mean, Dr. Xavier makes an interesting reference to the adequacy or the still relevance of the WTO, of the United Nations. I mean, one might also include NATO in that, in the context of a lot of this is supposedly about NATO's move to the east, but ultimately it's also appearance about NATO's lack of robust ability to project itself. Your thoughts on this restructuring globally that the Russian-Ukraine crisis may have reference to?
First of all, I agree. There is obviously a big global restructuring going on. It's probably instructive to draw a comparison. The last time we had a big crisis with 400,000 at the time Russian or Soviet troops amassed around the borders was in the 80s in Poland, 1980. At that time, there was a meeting between Deng Xiaoping and Brzezinski in Beijing. They were toasting each other with Russian vodka, or Soviet vodka at the time, famously saying, down with the Soviet Union. So that was the kind of, and Russia was moving into Afghanistan and so then withdrew its forces because they just thought they could not sustain it. And the war was avoided. Secondly, when we said China, or when Javier said China, nobody else wants war, this is not necessarily the categories in which Putin or probably the Chinese leadership think about it. This is just, a limited political action with military means, getting the Ukraine back into the fold, getting Taiwan back into the fold. And it has surprising parallels. The Ukraine is not a NATO member, Taiwan is not a NATO member. In both cases, NATO has made some lukewarm promises to protect them. In Taiwan, some legal promise to the US. So it's a complicated situation. But I think if we want to pray with Xavier, then we should pray that there is no deal between Russia and China to do Ukraine and Taiwan in one go, just to flex their muscles. When you read this joint statement issued by China and Russia when Putin visited the opening ceremony of the Olympics, it's a stinging criticism of NATO. Right? And while it is true, I think that most of the global institutions, as Xavier has referenced, have lost their teeth and have lost their ways in many ways. This is probably less true for NATO than for anybody else, because NATO is not a global institution. NATO is unchanged compared to 30 years ago in that it is a club of Western countries, just has been expanded. And the history is a very sad one, because of course it is true that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan dangled to Gorbachev the prospect of a transition to Western values in a capitalist economy without NATO expansion. And it's also true that Yeltsin signed that away. And there is no doubt when you talk to any Russian conscious of history that what he thought about the mindset of Yeltsin when he signed on to NATO expansion without need, despite these previous, hints that it wasn't necessary. It's also true that NATO forces bombed Serbia without informing the UN or Russia beforehand. These are things which sit very deeply with Putin and his circle. And I know that because I worked with some of these people. And so there's a suspicion towards NATO which sees it as an enemy. There's this famous saying Putin said to the Finnish president, now when we look across the border, we see a Finnish person. Tomorrow, when you join NATO, we look across the border, we see an enemy. And some of that is rhetoric, because the game, of course, is not to have a flourishing Ukraine. It's not that he really feels threatened by NATO. But some of that is, to use that as a scapegoat in a way which is very different from criticizing the UN or criticizing the IMF for the World Bank. So the world is fragmenting. The new institutions which seem to surviving are those like the Silk Road project, like the NATO project, like bloc tied to a particular bloc or a particular country, and no longer global. So the global element is fracturing. And the last point I would make in this context is the way in which different regions will flex their muscles. There is a really, really, really deep distrust in Russia on all levels of the population of being the ally, or much less the junior partner of China. And China is going to come to Siberia, is going to be so powerful. Now you look at these crumbling Russian cities, you look across the river, and where there used to be dusty villages are gleaming skylines. There's fear and there's distrust of that. And many in Moscow feel that the West over the years has pushed them into a corner where they now have to stand with China, with Saudi Arabia, with a part of the world where they don't, rightly or wrongly, they didn't consider themselves a part of. They considered themselves a part of Moscow, Berlin, Washington, this part of the world. And they're pushed off that harder and harder. And that also explains some of this unfortunate sort of retrenchment of both sides, which we're seeing now. Whereas the West has forgotten about Moscow, it became unimportant. And objectively it is.
Let's go to the survey question and just get a view of the room on my opening comment, which is, have the markets adequately priced in the consequence of a full Russian takeover the country, occupy, invasion of Ukraine? And when I mean the markets, I mean all financial markets. Clearly, oil has priced in some geopolitical risk. My sense would be not enough given the scale of what's on the cards. But nonetheless, this is about all financial markets. Yes or no? Dr. Xavier, as part of this big restructuring, and perhaps given the moment that we're witnessing in Ukraine, China has been making for some time, big moves towards the transition, new energy sources. From a security of energy point of view, is that likely to accelerate as we witness events like Ukraine? China is very dependent on imports of oil, particularly in gas, and has a lot of its own coal. But nonetheless, the transition, is that part, and will it become increasingly accelerated, part of China's national security, its energy security, to have its own renewable capabilities?
Well, I think the Chinese transition has been always, this a balancing act between energy security and also reducing carbon and all kinds of solutions. So I would say that the Chinese term is not really low carbon but low emission. And then their officials proposed the 14 5-year plan many sub-plans are called green industrial development, green energy development, green everything. So greening is a key word. And this is not only about the carbon, but also about the local pollutions with air, water, or solid emissions. So, and the second thing is that, last year was very significant for the energy world is that China became the first LNG importer, overpassing Japan. And then China has been already the largest gas importer. If you combine, LNG and gas together, I think 3 years ago, China already becomes the largest gas importer. So LNG come from Australia, Qatar, and US, many different sources. But the gas pipelines are only essentially from Central Asia and Russia, and a little bit from Myanmar. And then that's why, remember earlier this year, there is a turmoil in Kazakhstan. So that was a real concern for the Chinese. If all these Central Asia pipelines transition through Kazakhstan were shut down, how would the Chinese, spend the winter? So the Russian intervention in Kazakhstan to quickly put off the turmoil and keep the country at least stable for the moment is a big help, I would say, to the Chinese gas supply. And then furthermore, Russia gas, many actually suspected, this power of Siberia would work. And it worked according to plan. And now they're planning to have a new one. So I would think, when last time we talked, I said that the China natural gas will continue to grow. And we will see the peak around the 2040. So still 20 years to grow. And then already, if you exclude the UK, from European Union, China is already the second largest gas market after the United States. And then even if you include the European Union, you would China would even if you include the UK in the European Union, I think next year or this year even, China would overpass the former EU, as a natural gas market. So I think natural gas developed very quickly because the Chinese view natural gas not as a transition fuel, but as a major fuel in the energy mix. And this will last in the foreseeable future, even in a period where China reaches carbon neutrality, gas will still be a very important part of the energy supply.
Let's give Christoph the last word this morning with the survey result. No, the markets 2-1 have not priced this in. Obviously, Christoph, this is a week in review show. It's also a week ahead show. So looking at the week ahead, the last week of the Beijing Olympics, Winter Olympics, the sort of all the noise around the Ukraine story coming in the coming, expected to be synchronized with the end of the Beijing Olympics. How do you see the next week? Markets will open in a few hours. The news over the weekend, is it likely to be turbulent for the markets, do you think?
For some parts of the markets in Europe and in Russia in particular, certainly. But what we have seen, I misunderstood your first question. I thought it was just oil.
No.
But what we have seen was very strange because very hard to disentangle, because Friday night or Friday afternoon, we had the inflation number coming in higher than expected, indicating rising inflation. And that is, of course, what markets were disappointed by. And we saw the hardening of the conflict in Russia, Ukraine, and the American warning. Markets tumbled. Most observers took this to mean that there was a reaction to the inflation number, not so much to what happened in Russia. Now, when you look at a serious situation with the possibility of war there will be a lot of people who say, okay, when the cannons thunder, thou shalt buy. And there will be a lot of arguments, rightly so, that not much will be affected in real terms, because even if Russia is cut off financially, as I said, they had already minimized their dollar transactions. There are some banks imposed, there are some individuals exposed, but it's not a big chunk of global financial markets. And so you would expect at least the American markets to be relatively unaffected by that. The Russian market has gone down and then last week has actually recovered quite nicely. It was back up 12% from a decline of about 30%. I would expect that to go to its knees in the next week. And then the Ukrainian market, I don't really observe, but Ukrainian sovereign bonds also had been down and were also up last week. The market clearly, especially in those segments where it matters, in Russia and in the Ukraine, was not pricing in a full-scale invasion. And whether this will, if that doesn't change Monday or Tuesday, then maybe the bet which I would be taking that there will be no full-scale invasion get some more support from then maybe more people in the market take that view. But even in the worst case, I would not expect this to be the catalyst which brings about a big financial crisis. For that, Russia, the Ukraine, the neighboring countries are not important enough as part of the global financial architecture. It's very different as part of the commodity and global energy architecture. But as I said, most people would expect energy exports, commodity exports to continue even in case of a war. Or I should say an occupation, there will be not much of a war. Huh? Yeah. It's going to be a 3-day shootout at the end of it. Because every Western force already announced we will not send troops on the ground. So it's basically they hand him this on a platter.
I think we'll wrap it up there and think a bit. Once you push over the first domino, one really doesn't know how the other dominoes will fall, and it will all be about the reaction and the reaction of the local people on the ground in Ukraine, how they react to an occupation, how the markets react, how the sanctions, and all of those dominoes that are then fall on the back of this event, if indeed it does transpire. That will be the thing to watch, obviously, and read the tea leaves on that. We saw some headlines overnight saying that SWIFT, excluding Russia from SWIFT, had been taken off the table. That in itself is nearly an invitation for Putin to proceed. But nonetheless, those are the things to watch. Dr. Xavier, wonderful to have you from northern Thailand, from Chiang Mai, a place I have spent time and really, really enjoy. Christoph, as always, thank you for giving us your insights on Sunday mornings. Have a great week, everybody. We're here every morning at 10:30 a.m. UAE time. All the best. Thank you.
Yeah, so I will play the curtain for next time. No war in Ukraine, no war in Taiwan,
Inshallah.
And no simultaneous war.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Exactly. Ma salama.